For 1,095 days, Mateo and I shared the same wooden table in the center of the kitchen. We never spoke. The only sound that filled the space between us was the metallic clinking of silverware against porcelain and the relentless tick-tock of the wall clock that seemed to count down the seconds of our sentence. It was our implicit rule, an invisible pact we signed with silence so we wouldn't keep bleeding from the wounds of the past. But last night, everything changed. Mateo didn't come down to dinner at 8 o'clock sharp as he always did. Instead, on his empty plate, I found a white envelope folded in half, and suddenly, the silence that had protected me for 3 years became my worst enemy. It had all begun 3 years ago, on a rainy night much like this one, when our relationship shattered into 1,000 pieces. The love that once seemed invincible, the one we swore would move mountains, transformed overnight into a destructive storm of reproaches, misunderstandings, and hurtful words that drove like daggers into the chest. The promises were broken, and the air in the house became unbreathable. We realized we were destroying each other, trapped in a toxic cycle we didn't know how to escape. Anyone in their right mind would have left, packed their bags, and never looked back. But real life isn't a perfect movie. We were tied down by a massive shared debt for the apartment we had bought full of hope, a suffocating bank loan that neither of us could afford on our own salary. Neither of us had anywhere else to go, no family nearby, and not enough savings to start from scratch. So, cornered by economic reality, we made the most extreme and painful decision to survive. We would become absolute strangers under the same roof. To achieve this, we designed a perfect and millimetric choreography to never cross paths in the hallways. I would wake up at exactly 7 in the morning to use the kitchen, prepare my breakfast, and shower. He would do so at 7:30, just as I had already locked myself in my room to work from home. The only trace he left of his existence in the mornings was the subtle and persistent aroma of freshly brewed coffee floating in the air, an aroma that reminded me with silent violence that he was still there, just a few feet away from me, breathing the same air. We divided the refrigerator with black electrical tape, his side and my side. We never touched each other's food, never used the same cups. We learned to walk on tiptoe across the wooden floor to avoid making noise, and to close doors with extreme gentleness so as not to announce our presence. We became experts in the art of evasion. We became two ghosts trapped in the same house, voluntarily ignoring the love story we had once written between those same 4 walls that now felt like a prison. Dinners were the only and torturous exception to our strict rule of physical distance. For some reason that I couldn't even understand myself, neither of us wanted to give up eating at the dining table at 8 at night. So we sat opposite each other, rigidly, devouring the food with our eyes fixed on the plate or lost in some point on the white wall behind the other. I could feel his breath. I could perceive the movement of his hands out of the corner of my eye. But my eyes never rose to meet his. Over the course of those 1,095 days, the silence stopped being awkward and transformed into a solid, cold wall. A wall we built brick by brick to protect ourselves from ourselves, because we knew that a single word, a single direct look, could reignite the flames of a fire that almost consumed us completely. We got used to the coldness, to the faked indifference, assuming that this was the only way to coexist without destroying what little was left of our sanity. However, in the final months of this 3rd year, something subtle and almost imperceptible began to change in our icy coexistence. They were small details that defied the logic of our pact, tiny cracks that began to appear in our wall of ice. They weren't words, because the silence remained absolute, but they were actions that spoke with a heartbreaking eloquence, and that began to unsettle my heart in a way I didn't want to admit. One especially gray and cold Tuesday this winter, I returned from the supermarket soaked to the bone from a sudden storm that caught me off guard in the street. I was shaking uncontrollably as I set the grocery bags on the floor of the entryway. Upon entering the kitchen to look for a glass of water, I found a steaming mug on the table. There was no note, no written message, but as I got closer, the aroma revealed that it was exactly the kind of herbal tea with ginger and honey that I used to drink to avoid catching a cold when I got wet. I stood motionless, watching the steam rise from the cup in the silence of the empty kitchen. I knew perfectly well that Mateo had prepared it just a few minutes before I walked through the door, calculating the time. That silent and protective gesture hurt me in the depths of my soul, much more than any scream or reproach from the past. It meant that he still knew what I needed, that he was still watching me, and that, in some twisted and distant way, he still cared about me. A few days after that incident, the fragile bubble of our truce burst in the most unexpected way. I was walking through the center of the city during my lunch hour, lost in my thoughts, when I saw Mateo in the distance on a crowded avenue. He wasn't alone. He was walking alongside a young and elegant woman whom I didn't know. He was smiling in a wide and relaxed way, a smile I hadn't seen on him for more than 3 years. She was laughing at something he said and touching his arm with a familiarity that made my stomach turn. In that precise moment, I felt a stab of jealousy so violent, physical, and heartbreaking that it literally left me breathless in the middle of the sidewalk. I had to lean against the wall of a building so as not to fall. I believed with all my heart that after 3 years of trained indifference and emotional walls, nothing he did would matter to me anymore. I repeated to myself that I no longer loved him, but I was completely wrong. The fire of our passion was not dead. It was just buried under tons of ashes and pride. That same night, during our usual silent dinner at 8, the tension in the room was so thick and heavy that it could almost be cut with a steak knife. I couldn't stop thinking about the image of Mateo smiling at that stranger. The anger, pain, and frustration were building up in my throat, threatening to overflow. Unable to bear another second of that farce of indifference, I intentionally slid my fork along the edge of the porcelain plate until it fell to the floor with a metallic crash that echoed throughout the house. Mateo stopped in his tracks, his bite halfway to his mouth. Slowly, he set his silverware on the table and bent down to pick the fork up from the floor. As he straightened up to return it to me on the table, his fingers deliberately brushed mine. It was like a high-voltage electric shock running through my entire spine, making my skin crawl and my heart beat at a frantic pace. It had been 3 years, 1,095 days exactly, since I had felt his skin against mine. In that instant of minimal physical contact, the floodgates of my memory burst open, and the memories hit me with the devastating force of a hurricane. I saw myself 4 years ago, running happily and laughing out loud under a torrential downpour in his arms, soaked but completely oblivious to the outside world. I remembered how he looked at me back then, as if I were the only star in the entire universe, and how we solemnly promised each other that nothing and no one in this world would ever manage to separate us. I also remembered, with a painful clarity, the fateful night of the big breakup. The desperate screams that echoed off the walls of this very apartment, the bitter tears that blurred our gaze full of rage, and the horrible feeling of watching what we loved most fall apart between our fingers without being able to do anything to stop it. We loved each other too much, with an intensity that bordered on madness. But that same excessive love was destroying us because we were immature and didn't know how to sustain it without hurting each other in the process. We had decided on absolute silence because words had become lethal weapons between us. Every phrase was a reproach. Every conversation ended in a pitched battle where the unconscious goal was to hurt the other's pride. We naively thought that if we stopped talking, the wounds would stop bleeding and eventually scar over. But now, with my heart beating in my throat after the brush of his fingers, I realized the terrible truth. Silence hadn't healed us. It was just bleeding us much more slowly, drop by drop, in an endless agony. Last week, the rigid routine of our coexistence broke completely and alarmingly. Throughout the early morning of a Thursday, I heard Mateo coughing violently through the thin walls of the hallway. It was a dry, persistent, and painful cough that seemed to tear his chest apart. The next day, for the first time in 3 years, the coffee maker remained turned off at 7:30 in the morning. There was no aroma of coffee in the air, no sound of dishes in the kitchen. The silence of the house was different, heavy, and charged with a bad omen. Fear for his well-being finally conquered my pride and the strict rules I had imposed on myself. I waited until 8:30, and hearing no movement, walked down the hallway and knocked softly on his bedroom door. Upon receiving no answer, panic seized me. I turned the knob and entered. I found him shaking uncontrollably between the sheets of his bed, sweating cold and consumed by a high fever that made him delirious with his eyes half open. In that second, I forgot the rules, forgot the pact of distance, forgot the pain of the past and the promises of indifference. I went running to the bathroom for warm water and towels. I spent that entire anxious night sitting at the edge of his bed, placing damp cloths on his forehead to lower his temperature and holding his burning, trembling hand in mine so he wouldn't feel alone. In the midst of his feverish delirium, Mateo squeezed my hand tightly and whispered my name several times with a tenderness and desperation I thought were long gone. I wept in silence for hours in the dim light of his bedroom while I cared for him with devotion, realizing the terrifying truth that I had been trying to hide even from myself. I was still deeply and helplessly in love with the man I pretended to ignore and hate. At dawn, when his fever finally broke and his breathing became calm and regular, I let go of his grip carefully and slipped back to my room, fearful of what would happen if he discovered me there upon waking. Pride and the fear of being rejected still dominated me. Yesterday afternoon, while I was deep cleaning the living room, taking advantage of Mateo being out to run some errands, I moved some old papers that were piled up on the furniture in the entryway. As I lifted them, a small, shiny paper fell to the floor. I bent down to pick it up, and my heart stopped in its tracks as I realized what I was holding in my hands. It was a printed electronic plane ticket, a one-way flight to the other side of the world, to a distant country. And the departure date was tonight. Panic paralyzed me completely in the middle of the living room, leaving me breathless and with the ticket trembling between my fingers. Mateo was leaving forever. He was going to cross the ocean and put thousands of miles of distance between us. I understood then the horrible reality of our situation. The pact of silence over these 3 years had not been a truce to give us time to heal and start over, but had simply been the countdown to his final and definitive surrender. He was giving up, and I was about to lose him forever without having done anything to stop it. Dinner time arrived, 8 o'clock at night sharp. The atmosphere in the apartment was denser, heavier, and more melancholic than ever. Outside, the rain beat with renewed fury against the window panes, and the wind howled through the cracks as if the sky itself were screaming the pain I carried contained in my chest. I sat at the kitchen table in my usual spot, my heart beating 1,000 miles an hour, waiting desperately for him to come down the stairs for our last dinner together. But the minutes passed, and the seat opposite mine remained painfully empty. The tick-tock of the wall clock now sounded like the ticking of a time bomb about to explode. It was then that I looked closely at Mateo's plate. There was no food on it. Instead, rested a white envelope folded in half that had captured all my attention and that I didn't dare touch for fear of what it might contain. With trembling hands and tears blurring my vision, I finally took the envelope, opened it, and began to read the words traced in his firm and familiar handwriting. The letter read, "Dear Elena, If you are reading this, it's because I have finally gathered the courage to leave. For 1,095 days, I tried with all my might to learn to hate you in the silence of this house, but I failed miserably. I only learned to love you in secret, watching you out of the corner of my eye and keeping every detail of you in my memory to survive the distance we created ourselves. I am leaving because looking at you every day across this table and not being able to hug you, not being able to ask your forgiveness, and not being able to tell you how much I love you is slowly killing me inside. The note continued with a revelation that tore my soul apart. Don't worry about the bank or the debts. The apartment is already completely paid off. I've been assuming the entire debt in secret over these 3 years, working double shifts and depriving myself of everything so that you could keep a safe home free of burdens when I was gone. It's the last thing I can do for you to try to repair a little bit of the damage I caused you in the past. I looked up from the letter, my chest aching from the contained weeping, and my eyes flooded with tears that fell freely onto the paper. And there he was. Mateo was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, looking at me with infinite sadness in his dark eyes. He was wearing his coat, and his large suitcases were already waiting by the apartment's exit door. The taxi that would take him to the airport was probably already waiting downstairs in the street in the rain. I finally broke the heavy silence of 3 long years with a trembling thread of a voice that I barely recognized as my own. I asked him why he hadn't said anything before, why he had let me live in that painful and cold lie for so long, if he still felt all that for me. I asked him why he had carried the weight of the debt alone while I drowned in my own wounded pride, believing that he no longer cared about anything regarding our life together. Mateo took a slow step into the kitchen, and his voice, usually so firm, broke completely as he answered me. He locked his eyes onto mine for the first time in years and confessed to me that on the night of our breakup, he promised himself never to make me cry again because of him. He told me that seeing my tears at that precise moment, falling on the letter he had written, meant that he had miserably failed his promise once more, and that was why he had to leave to let me be happy. I didn't think. I didn't measure the consequences or let pride stop me this time. I jumped up from the chair, ran towards him, closing the distance between us, and melted into his chest in a desperate and possessive embrace that seemed to wipe away the 3 years of distance, coldness, and self-imposed silence in one stroke. Mateo tensed for a brief second, surprised by my reaction, but immediately wrapped his strong arms around me, pinning me to his body as if he feared I would vanish like a ghost. We kissed with a savage and desperate urgency, spilling into that physical contact all the unsaid words of love, the forgivenesses we owed each other, and the accumulated pain we had been jealously guarding in our chests for 1,095 days. It was a kiss salted by the tears of both of us, a kiss that tasted of regret, but also of a hope reborn from the ashes of our stormy past. When we finally separated just a few inches to be able to breathe, with our foreheads resting against each other and our hearts beating in unison, Mateo looked me straight in the eyes with an intensity that burned me. Outside, the taxi's horn broke the atmosphere by sounding twice in the street, reminding us that time was truly running out. He took my face in his large hands and told me in a hoarse voice, "If you ask me to stay, Elena, if you tell me that you still love me, I will throw that suitcase out the window and dismiss the taxi right now. But you have to tell me for real, looking me in the eyes. I will not bear a single second more of silence between us.